It's hard to win an AFL premiership. Like really, really hard. So hard, in fact, that only 59 head coaches have done it. Ever. If you dig a little deeper, you find feats in the sport even more impressive, like Jock McHale's historic 8 premierships, or Norm Smith's 5 premierships in 7 years. But what about winning as a rookie senior coach? On the 18th of October, 2010, a then 35-year-old Christopher Michael Scott was announced as the next head coach of the Geelong Football Club, following Mark Thompson's resignation at the end of the 2010 season. Less than 1 year later, Chris Scott and the Geelong Cats were AFL premiers. This was Geelong's 9th premiership, but only their 3rd since 1963. The Cats were in the middle of a mini dynasty, having won 3 in 5 years, and putting themselves among the great teams in history. The first 2 of these were coached by Mark Thompson, who led the club for the entire first decade of the 21st century. But come the end of 2010, Thompson was reportedly done with coaching, telling Fox Sports he could not give the multi-year commitment that the Cats were looking for in his next contract. Geelong would also lose father-son and 2009 Brownlow medalist Gary Ablett Jr. to expansion club Gold Coast, driven by the need for a fresh new challenge, according to the Herald Sun at the end of 2010. Scott stepped in to replace Thompson, and as they say, the rest is history. In May of 2022, Scott signed a 2-year extension to become Geelong's longest tenured coach. The same month, he became the club's all-time winningest coach. But once you reach the top, there's nowhere left to go but down. So what has become of Geelong in the decade since Scott's historic rookie win? Let's find out. This is Sporting News. Crunched. Before we get started, it's important to note that Chris Scott's tenure with Geelong has not been a failure. If anything, it's been one of the most successful stretches in club history. Since Scott took over, the club has qualified for the finals in 11 of his 12 seasons. The lone miss coming in 2015, where an 11-9 season saw them finish 10th, their lowest finish since 2006. Of these 11 finals appearances, however, 2 have resulted in a premiership, Scott's maiden year with the club, and most recently in 2022. The other 9 seasons ended with 1 grand final loss, 5 preliminary losses, 1 semi-final loss, and 2 elimination final losses. Across this period, one team has had the Cats' number more than any other, with 3 of Geelong's 9 finals losses coming against Richmond. They went down to the Tigers in the 2017 qualifying final, the 2019 prelim final, and most recently, the 2020 grand final, played at the Gabba. This repeated struggle with Richmond is even more interesting when you consider that over Scott's coaching career, his team has won significantly more than they've lost against Richmond during the regular season, an 11-3 record for a winning percentage of 78.57%. The fact that this win percentage is tied for the 8th best against an opponent is only a testament to the regular season dominance that Geelong have enjoyed during the past decade. They have been so strong that no team has a winning record against them throughout Scott's time as a head coach, with Sydney and West Coast the closest at 50%. But once the finals start, it's a whole different story. Richmond have been by far the most dominant team against Geelong during the Scott era, winning by 51 points in their 2017 clash, 19 points in 2019, and 31 points in the 2020 grand final, despite Richmond trailing at half-time in the preliminary and the grand final. But they haven't been the only team to flip the script on the Cats. Of Geelong's 25 finals games under Chris Scott, excluding 2022, they have won only 10, and only have winning records against 4 teams: Brisbane, Collingwood, GWS, and West Coast. How does it continue to go so wrong for the Cats? What has changed over the past decade, and what has stayed the same? Let's take a look. We already know what happened in 2011, as Chris Scott became the youngest premiership coach since Alex Jesaulenko in 1979. But despite this, the odds were still stacked against Geelong entering the 2012 season. For one, they were trying to become just the 3rd team since 1990 to go back-to-back, a feat that only Adelaide and Brisbane had accomplished. One of these teams, Brisbane, was also to that point the only team since 1990 that had completed a three-peat, winning 3 straight premierships. And a key part of the backline of that Brisbane dynasty, Chris Scott, who played with Brisbane for his whole career, spanning from 1994 to 2007, although he was denied a flag in 2003 due to injury. After Scott set a league record for most consecutive wins to start a season by a rookie coach, with 13 in 2011, 2012 proved to be less successful. Geelong would finish the season 15-7, never reaching higher than 6th on the ladder, which would be their eventual finishing position. Ironically, their season ended against the very team it started against, as they went down to the Dockers by 16 points in the elimination final. The Cats weren't able to go back-to-back, as Chris Scott experienced his first AFL season as a coach not winning the premiership. But if there was any silver lining, it was that Geelong had won a premiership in every odd year since 2007. And for most of the 2013 season, it looked like that trend would continue, Geelong reaching the mid-season bye with a 10-1 record, sitting in first place. The Cats were sitting atop the ladder with arch-rivals Hawthorn, and swapped positions for the remainder of the season. Ultimately, Geelong finished second, with just 4 losses. Frustratingly for Cats fans, the combined total of all 4 losses was just 23 points, an average of just 5.75 points per game. They also beat ladder leaders Hawthorn twice, in round 1 and round 15, continuing the Kennett curse from 2009 and extending the streak to 11. Wait, what's the Kennett curse? Well, to explain that, we have to go all the way back to 2008. The Kennett curse began shortly after the 2008 AFL Grand Final, when Hawthorn surprised the AFL world by defeating Geelong in the decider. Heading into round 1 of 2009, when the sides met again, Hawthorn president Jeff Kennett publicly stated that Geelong didn't have the same quality and drive as Hawthorn. Hearing this, Paul Chapman and the Cats players vowed to never lose to Hawthorn again, and for 5 years, they didn't. The streak lasted 11 games, from the beginning of 2009 until the 2013 preliminary final, when the Hawks finally broke the drought with a 5-point victory the week before the grand final. As the Kennett curse came to an end, so too did the Cats' 2013 season, with Hawthorn winning by 5 points and heading to their second consecutive grand final, despite Geelong leading by 20 points at three-quarter time. Hawthorn would go on to win the premiership that year, as the Cats came up short once again. 2014 began brightly for Geelong, winning their first 5 matches. Losing Joel Corey, Paul Chapman and Josh Hunt in the off-season, there was a new wave of young Cats coming through, led by Joel Selwood and Tom Hawkins. Remember those names, they'll be important later. Finishing third, the Cats faced a second-placed Hawthorn in a qualifying final and lost by 36 points. Their year would finish the following week against North Melbourne in the semi-final, going down by just a single goal. Ironically, Chris Scott lost to his twin brother and Roo coach, Brad Scott. 2015 was the worst in Chris Scott's career, with the Cats missing the finals for the first and still only time in his tenure. But 2016 marked a new beginning for the Cats, and that beginning was named Patrick Dangerfield. Dangerfield had already become one of the most prolific players in the league with the Crows, amassing 3 All-Australian selections across 154 games, and was the 2015 Adelaide Club champion. But his best was yet to come. Dangerfield was traded to Geelong in October of 2015, and Cats fans knew from round 1 that their team was on, when he single-handedly dragged his side to victory against reigning premiers and three-peaters Hawthorn. Danger had 43 disposals, 7 clearances, 3 behinds, a hanger, and claimed 3 Brownlow votes. And he just kept going, powering through one of the greatest individual seasons the AFL has ever seen, and finishing with averages of 32 possessions, 16 contested and the same uncontested, 5 marks, 4 tackles, 7 clearances, and at least a goal every game. When it was all said and done, Dangerfield had gained 35 Brownlow votes, which not only won him the medal, but was at the time the most votes a player had received in the 21st century. Since then, only 2 winners have polled more than Dangerfield, Dustin Martin in 2017 and Ollie Wines in 2021, both polling 36 votes. Led by Danger's historic year, The Cats didn't fall out of the 8 after round 1, finishing the year second by percentage with 17 wins and 5 losses. After dispatching Hawthorn in the qualifying final, they were set to come up against Sydney, who they finished 4 places above at the end of the regular season. But their year was ended by the Swans, who blitzed them in the first quarter, 7-0, and never looked back. 2018 was a somewhat confusing year for Geelong fans, as the Cats finished in 8th spot, only just squeezing into the finals with their second lowest finish under Chris Scott, after back-to-back second place finishes. But despite their disappointing finish, they had some electric moments throughout the season. 2 of Geelong's largest winning margins ever coming in 2018, including their largest ever in a season they did not win a premiership. But these big wins proved to be more sizzle than steak, as although the Cats snuck into the top 8, they were easily dispatched by Melbourne, who were making a triumphant return to finals footy following a 12-year absence of their own. 2018 might have been one of the worst Geelong seasons of the decade, but 2019 proved to be one of the best, finishing at the top of the ladder for the first time under Chris Scott. Leading up to the bye, Geelong lost only 1 match against GWS by 4 points, sitting 2 games clear of Collingwood, who were in second. But a form slump would strike the Cats, as they were unable to put consecutive wins together, performing a win-loss for the remainder of the season. Even despite the 5-5 record after the bye, Geelong still won the minor premiership, but their finals run would emulate the second half of their season much more than the first. They would lose to Collingwood in Scott Pendlebury's 300th game, bounce back with a big win against West Coast, before running back into that brick wall, which was Richmond. Richmond would go on to win the premiership, while Geelong's drought inexplicably continued. And then in 2020, the world changed.
Well, the AFL is again facing more COVID dramas. Thousands of footy fans were potentially exposed at the MCG.
Cases and a positive test has put the AFL season in jeopardy.
Yeah. So top of the agenda is the growing COVID cluster here in Melbourne and the ramifications for the AFL.
2020 was a COVID-19 ravaged season that featured postponed matches, clubs forced into hubs, crowds removed from stadiums, and a reduced season to just 17 rounds. Geelong began the year in poor form, losing to GWS by 32 points in front of an empty stadium. With the game and country going into a lockdown, the league then shut down football games for nearly 4 months, with round 2 played in the second week of June. But the Cats were able to be consistent in a year that was anything but, sneaking into the top 4. Their finals run got off to a rocky start, down by 16 points by Port Adelaide, but Geelong bounced back in a big way, with a 68-point win against Collingwood, followed by a 40-point victory against Brisbane. Geelong were back in the big dance, nearly a decade since their last trip. But they were back in the grand final against Richmond. They say that things happen in threes, and after beating the Cats in 2017 and in 2019, the Tigers' 2020 premiership was a fitting way to complete the trifecta, as they also claimed their 3rd premiership in 4 years, tied for the most of the last decade. Chris Scott and the Geelong Cats came up short once more. Heading into the 2021 season, age had become a significant factor for Geelong, coming off of a 2020 season in which the club registered 5 of the top 10 oldest sides ever to be fielded, including the oldest ever, an average of 28 years and 139 days on October 1st. In fact, age became somewhat of a calling card for Geelong, so much so that as of August 2022, the Cats occupied the entire top 10 oldest fielded sides, all registered between September 2020 and July 2022. But Geelong proved that age is just a number, as their 2020 grand final team added Jeremy Cameron and rocketed back into premiership contention. However, the Cats proved that regular season achievements could not translate to final success, taken out by eventual premiers Melbourne by 83 points in the prelim. We're nearly up to date, so what happened last year? In Chris Scott and Geelong's most recent run to a premiership, what was expected to be a down year instead turned into one of their best chances, finishing with an 18-4 record and their second minor premiership since Scott took over, tied for the most in that time. They opened their final series with a clash against Collingwood, who have proved to be a difficult task over the years. The memory of the 2019 qualifying loss still fresh. But these were not the Cats of old, and despite an impressive Collingwood effort, Geelong held on to win. After a week off, they would face Brisbane, but the Lions never stood a chance, downed by 71 points. Just like that, Geelong were back in the grand final, with growing belief that Scott could replicate the 2011 feeling that had since eluded the club. It would be Sydney who would face off against Geelong for the trophy, with much talk of the narrative surrounding Geelong if they were to win. Joel Selwood, who would be a premiership captain after taking over from Cameron Ling at the end of 2011. Patrick Dangerfield, who would finally be a premiership player after 300 games, joining Hawthorn's Shane Crawford in that feat. Tyson Stengel, going from twice delisted to an All-Australian and premiership player. Zach Toohey playing his 250th game in a grand final, or the Guthrie brothers becoming siblings who played in a winning grand final, a feat achieved by their coach and his brother 20 years ago. In the end, the Cats left no doubts. They demolished Sydney to the tune of 81 points, claiming their 16th win in a row and Geelong's 10th VFL-AFL premiership. 11 years after first tasting glory, Chris Scott returned to the top of the mountain. It may have been a somewhat roundabout way to achieve greatness, but there is no doubt that he's arguably one of the greatest coaches of the AFL's modern era.